Hello, this is Russell Moore, and you're listening to The Russell Moore Show, brought to you by Christianity Today. Every week, we explore here conversations and questions from a Christian perspective to help you sort out how to live as a follower of Jesus in confusing times. This week, we have a conversation to seek to do just that.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Those are some of the most famous words in American history. The I Have a Dream speech from the March on Washington 60 years ago, marking the anniversary of that historic moment. And at this moment, there's a new Bible study, Share the Dream, shining a light in a divided world through 6 principles of Martin Luther King Jr., authored by Chris Broussard, who's a sports analyst and commentator with Fox, and founder and president of the King Movement, and Matt Daniels, global human rights activist and founder of a nonprofit organization, Good of All, which is an organization that promotes human dignity across divides in a digital age. And so we have a lot to talk about there. They're producing this video series with Harper Christian Resources in collaboration with America's leading African-American church publisher, Urban Ministries, and the King Movement, which seeks to help men and boys reach their God-given potential in every area of life, and links principles to and practical ways of living out life based upon some of the key things that Dr. King taught. Professor Daniels, welcome to the Russell Moore Show.
Thanks for having me, Russell.
How did you become a Christian?
Well, I grew up in Spanish Harlem in a precinct with the highest rate of violent crime of any precinct in the borough of Manhattan. It was a very bad place. My mother was a single mom working to support us. She got off at the wrong bus stop one night, was assaulted by 4 guys, ended up disabled, ended up on welfare. So I grew up on a welfare income with a bunch of Puerto Rican and Dominican kids. Was not a believer, although I do believe God was protecting me at the time, or I wouldn't have made it out of my neighborhood. Education was my ticket out. I got a scholarship to Dartmouth and eventually to law school, but I had to put my academic career on hold because my mother was terminally ill. So I went back to New York City. For several years, I cared for her while she was terminally ill. And the Lord used that to call my attention at a young age, a relatively young age, to my own mortality. And I started seeking. And the Lord led me to Tim Keller's church in Manhattan. I was fortunate at the time. The church was relatively small. Tim was very accessible. And so I was really led to the Lord by Tim and a handful of people involved in the planning of that church. And that has shaped my trajectory. I have a fondness for common grace arguments. I have a fondness for reaching out into the world with messages that are for all people. I am uncomfortable, frankly, when I go into some sectors of the church that are somewhat self-segregated. I feel like we should be carrying this life-giving message to a culture that is going to die without it, and got to have an early dose of that when I was a new believer in New York City.
I did not know the Tim connection. It's really extraordinary coming out of just last week being at his memorial service and just thinking again about all of the lives that his work in New York was able to reach. That's really extraordinary.
Yeah, and it modeled, the church modeled for me, I think, what the church is going to need to look like in the future. We are a radically countercultural movement, and we should embrace that. And not build a subculture fortress and try to hide, but accept that that's our calling, to be agents of the kingdom in a culture that is lost.
What was the impetus behind doing a curriculum this way and now?
Well, there's the larger picture of where we are as a culture, which is something that causes great concern for me because I think we're spiraling down a path of division and polarization and violence. As you know, or you may know, 2023 will be the year of mass violence, the year in which there are more mass killings in America than any other year in our history. Notwithstanding our technological progress and our social progress, we're going backwards rapidly in this area. I work internationally, spreading ideas that have been proven to undermine efforts to recruit folks to various violent extremist movements. And I wanted to repurpose what I had learned internationally in the U.S. before we see things get to a serious and extreme level here, the way we've seen in some countries overseas. So I sought out Andrew Young, who I regard as sort of a Father Abraham type of figure. He's a great man of the faith who has lived a life of great service to the kingdom and to the country. And I had a conversation with Andrew Young. The seminal moment for me, really, was this discussion, this 5-hour discussion with Andrew Young, when I realized that I did not know the spiritual backstory of the early civil rights movement, that in spite of thinking I was fairly well educated, I had not been exposed to the spiritual dimension of the early civil rights movement, which is why they were able to overcome seemingly insurmountable barriers of violence, of legal, social, and cultural opposition. And that was the impetus for the curriculum, because I want that story to be known. People need to know the story. And those principles that worked half a century ago can work again today. We need them today.
What surprised you about the spiritual background of the civil rights movement?
Well, let me put it to you this way. I think that the historians who wrote the histories that I read were not trying deliberately to omit this central feature of the history. I think they didn't have the eyes to see it. So if you're a secular historian, you simply don't record these sorts of things. But when I met Ambassador Young, I asked him, how did you do it? I mean, how did you overcome the violence, the threats, the monolithic resistance that you faced? And with characteristic humility, he said, well, there weren't many of us. We were young. Some of us were pastors, but our churches were small. So we had to overcome by the Spirit. And I said, well, give me an example. And he said, well, we'd be planning to go to place A for a rally. Someone would have a dream the night before telling us to go to place B. So the next day, in obedience to the dream, we'd go to place B. And there'd be a bomb at place A that would have taken out the whole leadership of the civil rights movement in its infancy. When that happens to you, you learn to be led by the Spirit. And I thought, you were like the early church, up against insurmountable odds, having to rely upon the power of God to overcome the darkness, because as we know, God wants to get the glory, right? So he puts us up against these odds, and then he delivers us, and in this case, delivered a nation from a long, dark night of 400 years of slavery and segregation, not perfectly, but substantially. And that story should be known, I think, to every believer in the United States, because it's the greatest example in modern history of the power of the gospel overcoming evil. And we need to harness those same principles again today.
How do you think the civil rights movement, you think about how many people are involved, and it's difficult to maintain a kind of cohesion of all kinds of people who are involved in a mass movement. And yet the King-led aspect of the civil rights movement certainly did that. How? You just didn't end up with people. It would have been really easy, I think, for people to morph over into violence or resentment or bitterness, and that didn't happen.
Yeah, I will give you two answers. The first will be a human answer, the second a spiritual answer. So at the human level, never underestimate the level of strategic thought and discipline that went into everything they did. I'm always amazed when I hear the backstory of how disciplined and careful they were about what they said, what they did. They were constantly, as you know, being attacked from both sides, radicals in the black community who were angry at King for not embracing violence, obviously the white community. So there was a huge amount of discipline that went into the movement. Beyond that, I would say you just have to attribute it to the power of God. They were doing something that was receiving the favor and blessing of the Lord at a critical moment. It was a redemptive moment for this nation. And that's got to be part of the explanation, because really, from a human perspective, they shouldn't have been able to achieve what they did.
If you think about the speech itself that Dr. King gave at the March on Washington in 1963, it's resonant with scriptural allusions and direct quotations, but bound up in the King James Bible. There are some people who would say that could work in the early 1960s when there's kind of a cohesively, somewhat Christian-y American culture. But it wouldn't work now. Do you think that's right? If Martin Luther King were giving that speech at a march in 2023 instead of 1963, do you think it would be a more secularized message?
I would say this. Obviously, Dr. King was a pastor, and he was trained as a preacher. And so when he spoke through a tradition, and that was who he was as a person. That was part of his greatness as a leader. But what animated the movement are transcendent, universal principles that I believe originate in the heart and mind of the living God who loves all of his children made in his image. Human dignity is not a human concept. It's a reality that reflects the Imago Dei. That spiritual nuclear engine that powered the movement is as relevant today as it was then, and it's the best hope for the future. Never underestimate the power of this dream that Dr. King died to give our nation. You know, throughout human history and throughout the world today, most of the power structures of our world, most of the societies and political systems are organized in such a way that you only get your value based on how you serve the dominant idol or ideology. So in the fascist system, in the communist system, in the Islamist system, you are only valued by the degree to which you serve the dominant idol or ideology. It is a beautiful and radical idea that originates in the heart and mind of the living God that you have as a birthright, inherent innate dignity as a child of God. And that truth is as important and relevant today as it was half a century ago, because it's rooted in something transcendent.
I was hearing from a friend yesterday, African-American pastor of a large multi-ethnic church, who said, almost everybody I know is growing disheartened. People who were really enthusiastic and thought we really are reaching a time when racial reconciliation in the church and the church leading and pointing to the outside world what that could look like. It looked like that was happening. And now we're in a time when even the most basic sorts of conversations about race often end up with backlash. and people starting to become really discouraged that anything can be done about that at all. How would you encourage people who are having that sense, which is, I think, a lot of people?
I need to explain to you the framework that I look at this current era through, because it's really integral to my answer to that question. And I'm going to share with you something that I shared in my first meeting with Ambassador Young. When I first shared this with him 5 or 6 years ago, it probably sounded more alarmist, but events, I believe, have proven that it's actually reasonably accurate. At the time when I shared it with Ambassador Young, he was vigorously nodding his head up and down while I was talking, so I know he agrees with me. I tell my students that there are precious few laws in politics, but those that operate are powerful because they emanate from human nature writ large, so they tend to repeat. One of the dynamics or laws of politics is what I call the polarization of extremes. I believe this is what we are now living through as a country. Let me give you a historical analog. Now, I'm going to issue a little caveat. Everybody who studies politics knows that comparative politics is an imprecise discipline, okay? But with that caveat in mind, I'm going to engage in comparative politics. I want to talk about Germany in the 20s. Germany in the 20s is a highly cultured society, the nation of Martin Luther, of Bach, of Goethe. And yet, in a strange way, the nation of Germany is increasingly being held in the grip of two increasingly violent movements at either extreme, communism and fascism. And there are features to this story that that are not explicable, I believe, simply from a human perspective. For example, at that moment in history, the 1920s, no more than 20% of German people at most were active members of the communist or fascist movement. So you have 80% of the people trying to live their lives, mind their business, raise their families, and yet the future of the nation is hanging in the balance of this contest between these two violent movements. Second, a very bizarre feature of this moment in history. The two movements, which are supposedly polar opposites, feed off each other. They help each other to militarize. Every atrocity sparks recruiting by the fascists. Every atrocity by the communists sparks recruiting by the fascists. And so you get this militarization of the extremes while the middle is sort of sitting it out. And then one day, one form of militant evil crushes the other. You get darkness over the whole land, and the nation of Martin Luther becomes the nation of Adolf Hitler. Now, I would submit to you that if you really want to understand this, you need to look at it from a spiritual perspective. So I use another analogy. I call it the puppet show of darkness. Imagine you're at a puppet show. You see two puppets up on the stage fighting each other. One is a prince and one is a dragon. But you go behind the stage. You see it's the same guy with his hands in both puppets. It's a kind of cheap theater, a pincer movement, if you will, being hidden and concealed below the level of superficial reality by a unitary darkness. Think about it. National Socialism, which was Hitler's term for his movement, was fundamentally similar to socialism as practiced by Joseph Stalin. These are movements that demonize certain groups of people and then promise to renew society by killing them. In due course, Hitler made good on that promise and millions died. In due course, Stalin made good on that promise and millions died. Now, we look at German history and we celebrate figures like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, but he was the exception, not the rule. Unfortunately, the German Lutheran and Catholic Church really did not do their job well. We are Germany in the 20s. There are important differences between Germany 100 years ago and America today. Those differences actually militate in our favor. I won't go down the list, but we are better off than Germany was 100 years ago. Having said all of that, I guarantee you, we will go down the American version of the same path that Germany followed in the 1930s unless those who've been given spiritual sight by the Lord, who can see the puppet show of darkness, are willing to step up, sometimes outside their comfort zone, sometimes at risk to their name, their reputation, and courageously represent the values that can hold the center, as Martin Luther King did at the cost of his life 50 years ago. We were put here for this moment. This is actually our moment. And we cannot let the psychological warfare of darkness stop us from doing the job that we've been called to do. And that is to shine a light that can lead this country away from that trap of the rising polarization at the extremes. We're in the early stages, so there's still time, but God's people have to get on their game. And the church, to the extent it can, needs to act in unity, because we know that's the heart of the Lord, and we know that power is unleashed when the body of Christ acts in unity, and Dr. King's principles offer a great roadmap for us to do that.
I could not agree with you more on that. But how when so many people are assuming right now that we're kind of victims of impersonal forces, there's nothing really that I can do. There's something generically that the world can do, but there's nothing that I can do. And so there's this sense of sort of resignation. How do you reawaken something different than that in that
Well,
person?
I would say a lot of the struggle is perspective, right? Think about what Dr. King faced. Think about what his namesake, Martin Luther, faced. Think about what the disciples faced. And then consider our situation today. We're not, whenever I have a difficult day, I remind myself, no one is dragging me out of my home to lynch me or beat me to death in the streets. No one is bombing my office. I really don't have a right to complain. Anybody who works internationally, as I do, is familiar with the horrific abuse being endured by human rights activists around the world. So really, we have to overcome the psychological warfare that seeks to neutralize us. And we need to embrace the reality that we are the only ones with the answer. The world is dying. The world is dying because it does not know the way out of this trap. The trap leads to destruction. It leads to death. So this is our moment. And we don't need to be great in number. We just need to be great in our love for humanity and for the Lord, because the Spirit of God does a lot of the work, right? The formula that unleashes power in the kingdom of God is 100% the Lord, 0% us. And when you